Rose of South Carolina. Kitchen maid mixes poison drink that kills 15 people in host family. In the sweltering humidity of the summer of 1855, 15 members of the prominent Whitaker family perished in the span of a single hour at their Riverside mansion in Charleston, South Carolina. Official records buried deep in the state archives list the cause as a strange fever, but the hastily scrawled notes in the diary of Dr. Elias Hawthorne tell a different story. He wrote that he had never witnessed such simultaneous agony, with symptoms unlike any disease he knew. Skin turning a pallid blue, eyes bloodshot red, and final groans that echoed through the halls until dawn. What was more terrifying was that every death occurred exactly 60 minutes after the family's traditional Saturday dinner, and the only person in the house to survive was Rose, the head cook in the kitchen. For over a century and a half, this tragedy has remained a closely guarded secret in Charleston, hidden behind a wall of shame, fear, and deliberate silence. But today, we will uncover the truth of what really happened in that kitchen and why a powerful dynasty vanished in a single evening. Before we continue the story of Rose and the Whitaker massacre, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, because stories like this are exactly why we delve into America's dark, forgotten histories. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love connecting with mystery enthusiasts from all over the country. The truth of that deadly Saturday evening has its roots years earlier in a cycle of cruelty that would eventually demand its due. Charleston in 1855 was a city of contrasts, where magnificent mansions rose as symbols of wealth, while the very foundation of that prosperity rested on the labor of enslaved people. The Riverside district, where wrought iron fences and ancient oak trees dripped with Spanish moss like funeral veils, was home to the elite: cotton planters, timber merchants, and shipping magnates. The Whitaker Mansion was one of the jewels of the area, a three-story Greek Revival building with towering Ionic columns that seemed to reach for the Carolina sky. Harlan Whitaker, 45, had inherited both the house and a vast cotton plantation from his father, along with a reputation as a stern taskmaster, in the words of polite society, but a true villain according to his slaves. His wife, Amelia, a delicate woman of French lineage, had learned to turn a blind eye to her husband's cruelty to maintain her social standing. Their 4 children, Sebastian, 20, Clara, 18, Theodore, 16, and little Sophie, just 9, were raised to see the enslaved people around them as objects, no different from the silverware or the crystal chandelier in the dining room. The house contained not only the immediate family, but also Harlan's younger brother Everett and his wife Beatrice, along with their twin daughters, Eloise and Miriam, both 13. Everett managed the plantation's business affairs in the city, while Beatrice fancied herself a patron of the arts, hosting exquisite tea parties for Charleston's elite. Rounding out the household were Harlan's grandmother, Eudora Whitaker, 75, who still held great influence in family decisions, and Amelia's sister Felicity, a spinster with a sharp tongue and eyes that missed nothing that happened in the mansion. In this world of privilege and power lived 28 enslaved souls, each bearing the invisible scars of bondage. But none bore a heavier scar than Rose. Rose was born in 1,825 inches, the mansion's slave quarters, the daughter of Hattie, the previous cook, who had died of exhaustion when Rose was just 15. From that tender age, Rose was thrust into the role of cooking and preparing drinks for the very family that owned her body and soul. She possessed an almost supernatural skill in the kitchen. Her hands knew the exact amount of spice to add, the precise moment a sauce would thicken, and which herbs could turn simple ingredients into culinary masterpieces that earned the Whitaker family praise throughout Charleston society. But Rose's talent came at a price few in the house understood. She worked 16-hour days, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast and collapsing well after midnight when the last glass was polished. Her small, windowless room in the servants' quarters contained only a straw mattress, a change of clothes, and a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. What made Rose's situation even more unbearable was her unique position in the family hierarchy. As the head cook, she was responsible for maintaining the family's reputation for the most exquisite parties in the region. Yet, She was forbidden from tasting the very food and drink she prepared. She knew the consistency of a sauce by sight, the doneness of meat by smell, and the sweetness of a cake by intuition. This cruel irony was not lost on Harlan, who took pleasure in reminding her that though she created food fit for kings, she would eat only scraps for her entire life. The other slaves in the house looked upon Rose with a mixture of reverence and pity. They respected her skill and the small privileges her position afforded her. She was rarely subjected to the whip, was not sent to the cotton fields, and sometimes received hand-me-down clothing from the ladies of the house. But they also pitied her isolation, as her demanding schedule left little time for the friendships and small moments of joy that made a harsh life bearable. Among the house staff was Jacob, the 6-year-old son of the stable master, who had caught Rose's eye despite the danger of such a relationship. Stolen glances across the courtyard and whispered conversations in the kitchen after midnight had blossomed into a deeper affection. Though both knew that love was a luxury slaves were rarely afforded. Jacob dreamed of buying their freedom and starting a life in the free North, but on a plantation where a strong field hand brought in a mere $40 a year in profit for his owner, that dream was as distant as the moon. There was also old Esther, the head housekeeper, who had served the family for over 35 years. Her stooped back and silver hair telling the story of decades spent bowing to the Whitakers' commands. Esther had an almost preternatural ability to anticipate the family's needs, bringing a drink before it was requested, and knowing just when to disappear during private conversations. Her loyalty was famous in Charleston society, though anyone who looked closely could see a cold fire burning in her ancient eyes. Young Nina, only 17, worked as a lady's maid for Amelia and her daughters, her beauty not going unnoticed by the men of the house, which kept her in a constant state of fear of unwanted attention. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, trying to be invisible while performing her duties flawlessly. In the stables worked Marcus, Jacob's father, whose knowledge of horses was second only to his understanding of how to survive in a world designed to break him. Marcus had outlived 4 masters and buried 2 wives, learning long ago that the key to survival was never letting your true thoughts show on your face. The mansion's daily schedule followed a precise timetable established over decades. Breakfast was served at 6 o'clock sharp, the family gathering in the morning room overlooking the river. Lunch was at noon, often with guests from Charleston society dropping by to discuss business or socialize. But the Saturday dinner was the pinnacle of the culinary week. Every Saturday evening at 7 o'clock, the entire extended family gathered in the grand dining room under a crystal chandelier imported from London at enormous expense. The table, which could seat 25, was set with the finest porcelain, sterling silver, and crystal glasses that caught the candlelight like captured stars. These Saturday dinners were sacred to the Whitakers, a time to set aside business to celebrate and reinforce family ties. For Rose, the Saturday dinner was the culmination of her weekly efforts. She began preparations on Wednesday, selecting the finest ingredients from the local market and planning a menu that paid homage to the family's English and French heritage. The meal typically consisted of 8 courses: a light soup, seafood with a delicate sauce, poultry seasoned with exotic spices, multiple vegetable dishes from the household garden, a complex meat dish that showcased both her skill and the family's wealth, and finally, a dessert that was a work of art. The family's Saturday routine was as predictable as the sunrise. They would gather in the parlor at 6:30 for cocktails, the men enjoying imported cognac, while the women sipped light sweet wines. The conversation would range from plantation business to Charleston gossip, with the children expected to listen respectfully to their elders. At precisely 7 o'clock, Esther would announce that the meal was ready, and the family would proceed to the dining room with a formality that resembled a religious procession. Harlan always sat at the head of the table, with Amelia at the foot. The children and extended family members were seated according to a long-established hierarchy. Eudora, despite her age, held the place of honor to Harlan's right, while Everett sat to his left. The conversation during the meal was carefully orchestrated, with each family member knowing their role in maintaining the image of harmonious prosperity. But beneath that carefully constructed surface of tranquility, tensions simmered like a pot about to boil over. The spring of 1855 brought an unusual strain to the Whitaker household. The previous year's cotton crop had been poor due to a drought, and creditors were beginning to make uncomfortable inquiries about outstanding debts. Harlan had been forced to sell off a few parcels of land and was considering the unthinkable, selling some of his slaves to raise capital. These financial pressures made Harlan more volatile than usual. His temper, never pleasant, became explosive and unpredictable. The slaves in the house learned to read the warning signs, the way his jaw tightened as he reviewed his ledgers, the sharp edge in his voice when he gave orders, and most dangerous of all, the cold, calculating look in his eyes when he was devising some new cruelty. It was during this period of escalating tension that Rose's relationship with Jacob deepened, becoming too strong to hide or ignore. The event that catalyzed the tragedy occurred on a sweltering afternoon in late July 1855, when the Carolina heat seemed to press down on Charleston like a suffocating blanket. Rose was in the kitchen preparing for a party the Whitakers were hosting for some planters from Savannah, carefully arranging appetizers when she heard a sound from the courtyard that she recognized as Jacob's voice. Raised in pain, she rushed to the kitchen window and witnessed a scene that would change her life forever. Jacob was on his knees in the dusty courtyard, his shirt torn and bloody, while Harlan stood over him with a leather whip in his hand. The master's face was contorted with rage, spittle flying from his lips as he shouted accusations. "You dare touch my daughter?" Harlan's voice cut through the humid air. "Have you forgotten your place, you bastard?" Rose's blood ran cold as she realized what had happened. Clara, Harlan's 8-year-old daughter, had taken to visiting the stables recently, and Rose had noticed the girl's cheeks flush whenever Jacob was near. She had also seen Jacob's discomfort at the unwanted attention, his careful efforts to avoid being alone with any of the white women of the house. But in the twisted logic of plantation life, a slave's discomfort at unwanted advances was interpreted as arrogance, and arrogance was a capital offense. "Master Harlan, I would never." Jacob gasped between blows. "Shut your mouth." Harlan's whip cracked again, leaving another bloody welt on Jacob's back. But what happened next sealed everyone's fate. As Harlan raised his arm for another strike, Rose could no longer contain herself. She burst out of the kitchen door and threw herself between the whip and Jacob's bleeding back. "Please, Master Harlan, Jacob's done nothing wrong. He's a good man. He works hard." The words died in her throat as Harlan's face turned to her, his expression shifting from rage to something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating fury. The other slaves in the courtyard seemed to melt back into the shadows, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. "So," Harlan said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more frightening than a shout, "the cook thinks she can tell me how to discipline my own property." Rose's knees trembled, but she didn't move from her position shielding Jacob. "No, master, Only what?" Harlan stepped closer, so close she could smell the rum on his breath and see the web of broken blood vessels in his eyes. "Only thought you could interfere in the business of your betters. Thought that because you can make a fine drink, you have the right to question my judgment." The silence that followed was broken only by Jacob's labored breathing and the distant song of a bird from the garden. Rose knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return, but as she looked down at Jacob's bleeding form, she realized she didn't care. "Jacob is a good man," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "He doesn't deserve this." Harlan let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "A good man. He's property, you fool. My property. And so are you." He leaned in closer, his voice a whisper. "But I think you've forgotten that, haven't you? I think you've been getting ideas above your station." What followed was a punishment that went far beyond physical pain. Harlan ordered Jacob locked in the tool shed with no food or water, declaring he would stay there until he learned proper respect. But for Rose, he devised something far more cruel. From now on, he announced to the entire household, "Rose will prepare all the drinks as usual, but she will drink nothing until every member of the family has declared themselves satisfied with her work." And since I am a very difficult man to satisfy, he let the threat hang in the air like smoke from a fire. The next 3 days were an indescribable nightmare. Rose continued to prepare exquisite drinks for the family, while subsisting on nothing but water and the scraps Esther or Nina would sneak her when no one was looking. Her hands trembled as she stirred cocktails, her vision blurred as she mixed spices, and her legs struggled to hold her as she carried heavy trays to the dining room. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological torture Harlan inflicted. He found fault with every drink. The wine was too sour, the sauce too thin, the tea too bitter, and each criticism meant another day without food. He took great pleasure in describing the flavors and textures of each dish while she stood in the corner of the dining room, forced to watch him enjoy what she had prepared but could not taste. On the second day of her punishment, Jacob escaped from the tool shed, driven by desperation and worry for Rose. He made it only as far as the kitchen before he was caught by Harlan's men. The beating that followed was so brutal that Dr. Hawthorne had to be called to ensure Jacob didn't die before Harlan was satisfied. It was while tending to Jacob's wounds that the doctor observed something that would later prove crucial. As he cleaned the wounds, he noticed Rose hovering nearby, her face gaunt with hunger, but her eyes burning with an intensity that unsettled him. "That girl," he told his wife later that evening, "has the look of someone who has been pushed too far. I've seen it before in slaves who've been pressed too hard. It's a dangerous look." Dr. Hawthorne was a man who understood the fragile balance that held plantation society together. Born to a middle-class family, he had risen to become one of Charleston's most respected physicians, serving both the wealthy plantation families and secretly treating slaves whose masters would rather let them die than pay a fee. He had seen enough cruelty over the years to understand its effect on the human soul. He knew that most people, when pushed beyond their limits, would break, becoming empty shells who went through the motions of life without truly living. But a dangerous few would transform their suffering into something harder and more focused. These were the ones who would smile while they planned their revenge, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. When he looked at Rose that day, tending to Jacob's wounds with hands that should have been trembling with exhaustion but were steady with purpose, Dr. Hawthorne recognized the signs. He made a mental note to warn Harlan that his cruelty was creating a dangerous situation, but like many good intentions, he kept meaning to do it until it was too late. On the third day of the punishment, something in Rose died and something else was born. As she stood in the dining room watching Harlan savor her famous lemon tea, describing its flavor with theatrical enthusiasm, while she swayed with hunger, a cold clarity settled over her mind like a fog from the river. She began to notice things she had previously ignored. The slight tremor in Harlan's hands when he was anxious, suggesting his financial troubles were worse than the family let on. The way Amelia's eyes darted to the wine decanter when she thought no one was looking, hinting that the lady of the house was depending on alcohol to cope with her life. The way young Theodore would sneak glances at Nina when he thought his parents weren't watching, a look that made Rose's stomach clench with its implications. But most importantly, she noticed the family's habits, their preferences, their routines. She noted that Eudora always took her medicine 45 minutes before a meal. She observed Everett's nervous habit of checking his pocket watch every 20 minutes during dinner. She saw that little Sophie always ate her fruit first, saving her favorite part of the meal for last. These observations, which had once been merely part of her job, now took on a different meaning. She began to see the family not as her oppressors, but as a puzzle to be solved, a problem that had a correct solution. It was on that third night, when she finally collapsed onto her straw mattress after Harlan had grudgingly declared himself moderately satisfied with the evening's drinks, that Rose made the decision that would seal all their fates. She would continue to serve the Whitaker family with the same skill and dedication she always had, but in a way they would never forget. The plan that formed in her mind was not born of sudden rage or a desperate impulse. It was crafted as carefully as her most exquisite drink, seasoned with the patient wisdom learned from years of observing the family's habits and preferences. She would wait for the perfect moment, and when that moment came, she would serve the Whitaker family a dish they would remember for the rest of their lives. As August blazed with a heat that seemed to melt the very air, Rose's outward behavior returned to what the family considered normal. She went about her duties with a quiet efficiency, her mask of dutiful subservience showing no hint of the calculations going on behind her dark eyes. To a casual observer, it would seem that Harlan's punishment had achieved its desired effect. The rebellious cook had been broken and returned to her proper place in the household hierarchy. But those who knew Rose well noticed subtle changes. Esther, whose decades of survival had taught her to read people like she read weather signs, observed that Rose's movements had taken on a different quality. Where she had once worked with the fluid grace of someone who loved her craft, she now moved with the mechanical precision of a clock. Her famous skill in the kitchen, her ability to taste a drink with her eyes or know a tea was ready by the sound of the kettle, seemed to have sharpened into something almost preternatural. Jacob, still recovering from his beating in the slave quarters, watched Rose with growing alarm during their few stolen moments together. The woman he loved had once possessed a warmth that could melt butter, and a laugh that could banish the darkest moods. The woman who now visited him in the pre-dawn darkness seemed to be carved from a different material altogether. Her touch was still gentle as she dressed his wounds, but her eyes held a coldness that unnerved him in the way a snake's gaze unsettles its prey just before striking. "Rose," he whispered one morning as she prepared to return to the kitchen. "You're scaring me, my love. What's going on in that head of yours?" She paused at the door, her silhouette framed by the faint morning light filtering through the quarter's single window. When she turned back to look at him, Jacob saw something on her face that made his blood run cold. "I'm going to take care of everything," she said softly. "You won't have to worry anymore." What does that mean? Take care of everything. But she was already gone, leaving Jacob with the terrible certainty that the woman he loved was planning something that would destroy them all. The changes in Rose's behavior were so subtle that the Whitaker family remained completely oblivious. If anything, they were pleased with what they saw as the positive effects of Harlan's discipline. Rose's drinks had always been excellent, but now they seemed to reach new heights of artistry. Her presentations were more intricate, her flavor combinations more subtle, and her attention to detail almost obsessive. What the family didn't realize was that Rose had begun a different kind of study. On her daily trips to the local market, she started visiting places that had nothing to do with cooking. She began to frequent the stalls of herbalists and root doctors who operated in the shadows of Charleston's official commerce, asking questions about plants and their properties with an innocence that belied a darker purpose. Charleston in 1855 was a city where the line between medicine and magic, healing and harming, was blurry. Influences from African traditions, Caribbean voodoo practices, and Native American plant knowledge created an underground network of healers who understood the dual nature of many natural substances. What healed in a small dose could kill in a large one, and what was a balm to the body could be a poison, depending on the knowledge and intent of the person mixing it. Rose's visits were careful and spaced out. She never asked direct questions, but engaged in seemingly casual conversations about herbs and their uses. She learned which plants could cause a stomach ailment that could be mistaken for food poisoning, which mushrooms could induce symptoms that mimicked a sudden fever, and most importantly, which combinations of natural substances could confuse even an experienced doctor. Her most valuable source of information came from an unlikely friendship she developed with old man Cyrus, an elderly Creole man who sold herbs and remedies from a stall in the deepest corner of the market. Cyrus was rumored to be over 80, though his exact age was a mystery that deepened with time. He had been born a free man in Jamaica before the Great Revolution, and his knowledge of plants was legendary among those who knew to seek out his wisdom. Cyrus didn't ask why a kitchen slave was so interested in learning the medicinal properties of herbs and roots. Perhaps he sensed the desperation beneath Rose's carefully worded questions, or perhaps he simply understood that knowledge was a form of power that should not be denied to those who needed it most. Whatever his reasons, he began to share information that no respectable physician would have discussed with a slave. "This root," he would say, holding up a gnarled piece of bark, "good for digestive troubles in small amounts, but use too much, and it will cause the opposite problem. Make a man very sick, very fast." Rose absorbed the information like a sponge, filing away every detail for future reference. She learned about plants that caused shortness of breath, herbs that affected the heart's rhythm, and mushrooms that created neurological symptoms that could be mistaken for apoplexy or a sudden fever. But most valuable of all, she learned about timing and dosage. Cyrus explained how the body processed different substances, how long it took for a poison to take effect, and how to calculate a dose based on a person's weight and constitution. This knowledge transformed Rose's understanding of her craft. She began to see cooking not just as a way to nourish bodies, but to control them. As the summer progressed, Rose began to conduct small experiments that went completely undetected in the household. She added minute amounts of different herbs to various drinks, carefully observing the family's reactions. A pinch of a certain root might cause Everett to complain of a mild indigestion. A tiny amount of another herb might make young Theodore slightly nauseous after a meal. These experiments taught her about individual tolerances, sensitivities, and reactions, crucial information for her final plan. The family, of course, attributed any minor digestive issues to the heat and humidity of the Carolina summer. When Amelia complained of an occasional stomach upset, Dr. Hawthorne prescribed a mild tonic and advised her to avoid heavy drinks during the hottest part of the day. When little Sophie seemed lethargic after a few meals, it was attributed to the natural effect of the oppressive heat on a young child. Meanwhile, Rose's relationships with the other slaves began to change, reflecting her growing isolation and single-minded focus. She had always been somewhat apart from the other house staff due to the demands of her position and her long hours, but now she began to withdraw, even from the few friendships that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her enslavement. Nina, who had often sought Rose's advice and comfort in her most difficult moments, found her approaches met with a politeness that was distant and cool. Esther, who had served as a surrogate parent to Rose since her mother's death, noticed that their conversations became increasingly superficial and brief. Even Marcus, Jacob's father, began to feel uneasy around Rose, sensing something in her demeanor that reminded him of the dangerous dogs he had known. A quiet control on the surface, but coiled and ready to strike. The only person who seemed to have any insight into Rose's true state of mind was Jacob, and even he was kept at arm's length as she focused with increasing intensity on her preparations. In their rare moments together, he tried to draw her out, to understand what was happening behind her increasingly impenetrable mask. "You're changing, Rose," he said one August night as they sat in the small garden behind the slave quarters, whispering to avoid detection. "You're becoming someone I don't recognize." Rose looked up at the stars, barely visible through the oppressive humidity. For a moment, her mask slipped, and Jacob caught a glimpse of the raw pain and fury she had been carrying alone for weeks. "They took everything from me," she said softly. "My mother, my childhood, my freedom, and when I finally found something to care about, when I found you, they took that too. They beat you like an animal and made me watch. They starved me and made a sport of it." Jacob reached for her hand, but she pulled it away. "That doesn't mean you have to become like them." "I'm not becoming like them," Rose replied, and the coldness in her voice made the hairs on Jacob's arms stand on end. "They destroy for pleasure. I will destroy out of necessity." "What are you planning, Rose? What are you going to do?" She looked at him for a long moment, and Jacob saw something in her eyes he had never seen before, a kind of peace that was more frightening than any rage. "I'm going to serve them exactly what they deserve," she said. "No more, no less." As the summer began its slow transition toward autumn, Rose's preparations entered their final phase. She had identified the substances she would need, tested their effects in small doses, and studied the family's habits to the point where she could predict their behavior as accurately as a clock. Now all that remained was to choose the perfect moment and execute her plan with the same flawless precision she brought to preparing an 8-course drink. The opportunity she had been waiting for arrived in late September, when Harlan announced that the family would be hosting a grand Saturday dinner to celebrate a successful cotton harvest. The meal would mark not only the end of the harvest season, but Harlan's triumph over the financial difficulties that had plagued him for the past year. His creditors had been paid, his debts were settled, and the plantation was once again on firm financial footing. It would be, Harlan declared, a party to remember. As the heat of September eased into the early warmth of autumn, the Whitaker mansion buzzed with preparations for what Harlan declared would be the finest Saturday dinner Charleston had ever witnessed. The successful cotton harvest had not only saved the family from financial ruin, but had also restored Harlan's pride as one of the city's most prominent planters. The guest list for the celebration read like a who's who of Carolina society. Judge Leopold Granger and his wife, the family banker Victor Moreau, and the influential merchant Silas Beaumont. The Reverend Father Lucien Duval would be on hand to bless the meal, while Dr. Elias Hawthorne would attend both as the family physician and as an old friend of Harlan's. Even Mayor Benedict Harrow had accepted the invitation, bringing the total number of guests to 25 souls who would join the 15 members of the Whitaker family for an evening of celebration and excess. For Rose, this represented the culmination of everything she had been working toward. A grand Saturday dinner with the extended family and the most prominent citizens of Charleston would provide the perfect stage for her final performance. The scale of the event would require her to work with absolute precision, coordinating multiple dishes while maintaining the perfect timing that had made her reputation throughout the city. But what made this evening particularly perfect for Rose's purpose was Harlan's decision regarding the staff. Due to the importance of the occasion, he had ordered that all of the house slaves were to remain at the mansion for the entire evening, ready to respond to any need that might arise. This meant that when the moment came, everyone who had participated in or witnessed her humiliation would be present to see it resolved. As the days leading up to the dinner unfolded, Rose threw herself into her preparations with an intensity that impressed even the jaded members of the Whitaker family. She spent hours at the local market, selecting her ingredients with a fastidiousness that bordered on obsession. Every tomato was inspected for perfect ripeness, every cut of meat examined for its ideal marbling, and every herb tested for its potency and freshness. Her menu for the evening was a masterpiece of Carolina cuisine that showcased not only her skill, but also her encyclopedic knowledge of food and its effects on the human body. The meal would begin with a light crab soup, seasoned with a precise balance of herbs designed to stimulate the appetite and build anticipation for what was to come. This would be followed by salmon with a complex sauce that required hours of preparation and careful timing. The third course would be a turkey stuffed with a mixture of rice, vegetables, and spices that had been passed down from Rose's ancestors, though she had modified the traditional recipe in a way none of her ancestors would have approved. The meat course would feature both beef and pork, prepared in different styles, accompanied by vegetables from the mansion's garden and bread that had been proofed for just the right amount of time to achieve the perfect texture and flavor. But the dessert represented Rose's true masterpiece. She planned to serve her famous corn pudding with caramelized pecans and a custard sauce that had been the talk of Charleston society for years. The recipe was a secret her mother had passed down to her, a recipe that had been perfected in the plantation kitchens of Carolina for generations. Rose had spent the last month perfecting a very different kind of recipe, one that would make the celebration more memorable than anyone could have imagined. Her final preparations began on the Thursday morning when she made her last visit to Old Man Cyrus's stall at the market. The old man greeted her with the same knowing smile he had at each of their meetings. But this time, there was something different in his ancient eyes, a kind of sadness that seemed to acknowledge what was about to happen. "Are you sure this is the path you wish to walk, child?" Cyrus asked as he wrapped the last of the herbs Rose needed in a piece of brown paper. "Once it is begun, there is no turning back." Rose met his gaze without flinching. "I'm already too far down the path to turn back." They made sure of that. Cyrus nodded slowly and handed her the package. "Then may God have mercy on all your souls," he whispered, "for you'll find none elsewhere." Later that weekend, as Rose began the complex process of preparing for the Sunday feast, her behavior took on an almost ritualistic quality that unsettled those who observed her closely. She moved through the kitchen with the precision of a watchmaker assembling his finest timepiece, every action calculated and deliberate. The low hum she usually made while working ceased completely, replaced by a silence that filled the kitchen like a fog. Jacob, still recovering from his wounds, but now able to move with limited mobility around the plantation, found excuses to visit the kitchen throughout the weekend. What he saw filled him with an unspeakable dread. Rose worked with a mechanical precision, her face a blank mask as she prepared the components of the meal with a cold artistry that bore no resemblance to the joy she had once taken in cooking. On Friday evening, as Rose was completing her preliminary preparations for the next day's meal, Jacob finally confronted her directly. He waited until the kitchen was empty except for the two of them, then approached her as she stood cleaning a knife with obsessive care. "Rose, I'm begging you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Whatever you're planning, don't do it. We can find another way." She didn't look up from her work, but her hands stilled on the blade she was polishing. Another way to what, Jacob? To freedom? To justice? She finally raised her eyes to meet his, and Jacob saw something in them that made him take an involuntary step back. Do you think there's any justice for people like us? Do you think if we just wait long enough, pray hard enough, work hard enough, someone will come along and make things right? I think if you do what you're planning, you'll destroy yourself along with them. Rose set the knife down and turned to face him fully. I'm already destroyed, Jacob. All that's left is to decide whether I die alone or take them with me. What about me? What about us? For the first time in weeks, Jacob saw a flicker of the woman he loved pass across Rose's face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He might have imagined it. If you truly love me, she said softly, you'll find a way to be somewhere else tomorrow night. Jacob looked at her for a long moment, a final understanding dawning in his eyes. My God, Rose, what have you done? But she had already turned back to her work, and Jacob knew that any chance of changing her mind had passed weeks ago in a dusty courtyard under a blazing sun, when a whip fell on his back and something in the woman he loved died forever. Saturday, the 2nd of October 1855, dawned clear and cool, with the first hint of autumn in the air that made the citizens of Charleston grateful for the end of another brutal summer. The Whitaker mansion was alive before sunrise, as the house staff prepared for what everyone understood would be the social event of the season. Rose was up before dawn, as she had been every day for the past 10 years. But this morning carried a significance that went far beyond routine. As she put on her clean white apron and the headscarf that was the uniform of her position, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the single shard of a broken mirror that served as her dressing table. The face that looked back at her seemed to belong to a stranger, its cheeks hollowed from the weight she had lost during her punishment, its eyes holding a terrible peace. She took a moment to study the reflection, memorizing the face of the woman she had once been before turning away to begin the most important day's work of her life. The kitchen became a symphony of controlled chaos as Rose directed the preparation of the most complex meal she had ever attempted. But unlike previous large parties where she had worked alongside other kitchen staff, today, she insisted on handling the most critical elements completely alone. She prepared the sauces herself, mixed the spices without assistance, and guarded her workspace with a jealousy that surprised even herself. Esther, whose duties as head housekeeper required her to coordinate between the kitchen and the dining room, noticed that Rose seemed to have developed a preternatural awareness of everyone's location in the house. She would pause in her work at the sound of approaching footsteps, and on several occasions, Esther caught her listening intently to conversations in other rooms, as if tracking the movements of everyone in the mansion. That girl has the ears of a cat today, she muttered to Nina as they polished silver in the pantry. Stranger than I've ever seen her. Nina, her nerves on edge from the pressure of serving such important guests, nodded in vague agreement. She's been strange for weeks, ever since Master Harlan punished her and Jacob. What neither of them realized was that Rose's heightened awareness served a specific purpose. She had spent months learning the family's habits, but today, she needed to track their exact locations and activities to ensure perfect timing. Every element of her plan depended on a synchronization that would have made a Swiss watchmaker proud. As the morning progressed, the mansion filled with the sounds and smells of preparation. Fresh flowers were arranged in every room. The crystal was polished until it sparkled, and the dining room table was set with a precision that was almost mathematical. The finest Wedgwood china the Whitakers had imported from England gleamed against the Irish linen tablecloth, while the sterling silver caught the light from the chandelier like fallen stars. Around noon, the family members began their own preparations for the evening's festivities. Amelia spent hours with Nina, having her hair arranged in an elaborate style that required dozens of pins and a liberal application of pomade. Eudora, despite her age, insisted on wearing her finest black silk dress and the ruby jewelry that had been in the family for 3 generations. The men of the family gathered in Harlan's study to sample the cognac that would be served after the meal. Their conversation ranged from the success of the cotton crop to speculation about the political situation in Washington. Everett, flushed with pride at the plantation's financial recovery, was particularly jovial, telling stories of his shrewd business negotiations. Young Theodore and the twins, Eloise and Miriam, had new clothes made for the occasion, while little Sophie wore a white lace dress that made her look like a small angel. The children had been given strict instructions about their behavior for the evening. They were to be seen and admired, but to speak only when spoken to, and never to interrupt an adult. As late afternoon approached, the guests began to arrive at the mansion. Judge Granger and his wife Matilda were the first, followed by the banker Moreau and his daughter Isabel, a young woman whose beauty and dowry made her the target of every eligible bachelor in Charleston. Dr. Hawthorne arrived with his customary medical bag, though he hoped his services would not be needed on such a joyful occasion. The arrival of Mayor Harrow created a particular stir, as his presence lent an air of political importance to the gathering. The mayor, a portly man with an impressive beard and a penchant for long-winded speeches, immediately began congratulating Harlan on the success of his harvest and predicting a bright future for the Carolina cotton industry. But it was during the arrival of the guests that Rose executed one of the most critical elements of her plan. As the house filled with visitors and the normal routines of the staff were disrupted by the demands of hospitality, she made the final additions to the evening's menu. Working with the concentrated focus of a pharmacist preparing a prescription, she added carefully measured amounts of different substances to different components of the meal. Each dish received its own individual attention, with the added ingredients based on her detailed knowledge of each diner's preferences, physical constitution, and position at the table. The quantities were calculated with mathematical precision, enough to achieve the desired effect, but distributed in such a way that no single dish would contain enough to arouse suspicion if it were analyzed on its own. What made Rose's preparation particularly diabolical was her understanding of timing and cumulative effects. The substances she had chosen would work slowly and in combination, creating symptoms that would build gradually over the course of the meal before reaching a simultaneous peak. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it would be too late to identify the source or administer an effective treatment. As 7 o'clock approached, the family and their guests gathered in the parlor for cocktails and conversation. The atmosphere was one of celebration and triumph, with Harlan holding court like a king receiving tribute from his subjects. The conversation flowed as freely as the imported wine, covering everything from the latest fashions in Paris to speculation about the discovery of gold in California. Rose, observing from the kitchen doorway, felt a cold satisfaction as she watched the crowd. Every person who had contributed to her suffering, every family member who had participated in or ignored her humiliation, every pillar of society who had created and sustained the system that had robbed her of her life. They were all here, dressed in their finest and ready to enjoy her masterpiece. At precisely 7 o'clock, Esther appeared at the parlor door and gave a respectful bow. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced in her most formal voice, "dinner is served." Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror at the Whitaker mansion intensifies. If this story is sending a chill down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hitting the like button helps support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Let's find out what happened next. The procession to the dining room followed the formal ritual that had governed Whitaker meals for decades. Harlan led the way with Mayor Harrow, while Amelia followed with Judge Granger. The other guests and family members arranged themselves according to social hierarchy, with Eudora holding her place of honor despite needing the support of young Sebastian to walk the short distance from the parlor to the dining room. The dining room had been transformed into a vision of opulence that impressed even the most jaded members of Charleston society. Dozens of candles cast a warm glow over the assembled crowd, while the crystal glasses captured and refracted the light like trapped diamonds. The smell of Rose's cooking filled the air with the promise of the culinary delights that had mouths watering all over the house. As the diners took their designated seats, a sense of anticipation filled the room. Harlan had been praising Rose's skills all week, building expectations for what he declared would be the finest meal any of them had ever tasted. Even Dr. Hawthorne, who had eaten at the finest establishments in both Charleston and London, found himself looking forward to experiencing the legendary artistry of the Whitaker kitchen. Rose herself remained invisible to the diners, working behind the scenes with Esther and the other servants to ensure that each course was presented with perfect timing and arrangement. But unlike previous large parties, where she had taken a visible pride in each dish that left her kitchen, Tonight, she watched the service with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. The first course, a delicate crab soup, was met with the kind of enthusiastic praise that would once have filled Rose with joy. Judge Granger declared it a masterpiece of culinary art, while the banker Moreau pronounced it superior to anything served in London's finest restaurants. Even Eudora, whose critical nature was legendary, nodded her approval as she savored the complex blend of flavors. What the diners didn't realize was that the soup contained the first of several carefully measured doses that would work in combination throughout the evening. The herb Rose had chosen would be absorbed slowly into their systems, building toward a cumulative effect that would only manifest when all the ingredients were in place. The second course, salmon with a complex sauce that had taken hours to prepare, continued to receive universal acclaim. Mayor Harrow, whose appreciation for fine food was known throughout the city, pronounced it divine and asked for the recipe, which Harlan proudly promised to obtain from his talented cook. As the meal progressed, the conversation in the dining room became increasingly lively and jovial. The wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and creating a celebratory atmosphere that seemed to grow more festive with each course. Stories were shared, jokes were told, and toasts were raised to everything from the success of the harvest to the bright future of Carolina as a state. But Rose, watching from the kitchen doorway, began to notice subtle changes in some of the diners that would have escaped the notice of anyone else. Everett's usually hearty appetite seemed to have diminished slightly, though he continued to praise each dish with enthusiasm. Amelia seemed to be experiencing a mild discomfort, occasionally pressing a hand to her stomach in a gesture she tried to make subtle. Young Theodore looked a little flushed, though this could easily be attributed to the excitement of dining with such prominent guests. The meat course was presented with a procession that drew an admiring round of applause from the assembled crowd. The beef had been prepared according to a recipe that showcased not only Rose's technical skill, but also her artistic sense, while the pork dish demonstrated a combination of flavors that several of the guests declared they had never experienced before. It was during this part of the meal that Dr. Hawthorne first noticed something that would later prove significant to his understanding of what happened that night. As he observed the other diners with the trained eye of a physician, he began to detect subtle signs of physical distress that were inconsistent with the jovial atmosphere. Eudora, despite praising the food loudly, seemed to be having some difficulty swallowing. Her granddaughter Eloise was perspiring more heavily than the warm evening would warrant. The banker, Moreau's normally animated style of conversation, seemed to require more effort than usual, as if he were fighting some kind of fatigue. But these were fleeting observations, easily dismissed in the context of a rich meal being served on a warm evening to people who had spent hours celebrating. Dr. Hawthorne made a mental note, but saw no immediate cause for alarm, especially given the universal enthusiasm for each course that was presented. The dessert represented Rose's true masterpiece, not only of culinary art but of a more diabolical craft. The corn pudding was prepared exactly as her mother had taught her, with perfectly caramelized pecans and a custard sauce that had achieved an almost impossible consistency. But hidden within this triumph of traditional Carolina cuisine was the final component of Rose's deadly recipe. As the dessert was served, accompanied by coffee and after-dinner sweet wines, the praise reached almost ludicrous heights. Mayor Harrow declared that he would have to revise his opinion of the best dessert in Carolina, while Judge Granger suggested that Rose's talents were being wasted in a private household and that she should be cooking for royalty. Harlan basked in the glory reflected from his cook's abilities, accepting the congratulations as if he himself had created the magnificent meal. He raised his glass in a toast to the finest cook in all of Carolina, whose talents have made this a triumphant evening that will be remembered for years to come, if only he knew how prophetic those words were. As the meal drew to a close and the diners leaned back in their chairs with the satisfied weariness that comes from consuming a truly memorable feast, the first unmistakable signs of distress began to manifest. Everett, who had been telling an amusing story to the table just moments before, suddenly stopped mid-sentence and clutched his throat, his face contorted in a mixture of confusion and pain. "I feel," he began, but the words seemed to catch in his throat like a burr. Amelia, who had been delicately fanning herself with a silk fan, suddenly dropped it as her hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of old parchment. "Something is wrong," Dr. Hawthorne said, rising from his chair with the sudden alertness of a man whose medical training had just been activated by an emergency. But even as he spoke, he felt his own stomach lurch in a way that had nothing to do with overeating. Within minutes, the elegant dining room transformed into a scene of chaos and horror. One by one, the diners began to experience symptoms that progressed with frightening speed. What had begun as a mild discomfort quickly escalated into severe abdominal pain, accompanied by nausea, difficulty breathing, and a burning sensation that spread through their bodies like a wildfire. Eudora was the first to fall. Her elderly body could not withstand the assault of the substances coursing through her system. She collapsed from her chair with a crash that shattered the crystal water glass in front of her, sending shards across the mahogany table like deadly snowflakes. Little Sophie, her white lace dress now stained with sweat and worse, began to cry for her mother in a voice that grew weaker and weaker as the poison did its work. Her small body with its rapid metabolism processed the deadly substances faster than the adults, making her suffering both more intense and mercifully shorter. Mayor Harrow, his political dignity forgotten in the face of mortal agony, crawled across the dining room floor toward the door, leaving a trail of vomit behind him as his body tried in vain to purge the poison from a system whose organs were shutting down. Dr. Hawthorne, even as his own vision blurred and his hands trembled uncontrollably, tried to provide medical assistance to the other victims. But nothing in his training had prepared him for something like this. It was a mass poisoning that affected multiple body systems at once and seemed designed to overwhelm every natural defense the human body possessed. "Get help," he managed to gasp to Esther, who stood at the door, frozen in shock at the scene before her. "Send, send." But the words died in his throat as another wave of agony doubled him over, and he realized with the lucid certainty that sometimes comes in moments of extreme crisis that help would arrive far too late for anyone. In the kitchen, Rose stood perfectly still, listening to the sounds of chaos and death coming from the dining room. Her face was expressionless, but tears were streaming down her cheeks. They were not tears of regret, but tears of release, as if a pressure that had been building inside her for months had finally found a way out. Jacob found her standing like a statue in the middle of the kitchen she had ruled for so many years. He had tried to follow her advice and be absent from the plantation that night, but his love for her had made it impossible to stay away. Now, hearing the screams and seeing her tears, he understood the full extent of what she had done. "Rose," he whispered, reaching for her with a hand that trembled not from poison, but from grief. "What have you done?" She turned to him, and for the first time in weeks, he saw something in her eyes that resembled the woman he loved, but only resembled. The woman he knew was gone forever, replaced by someone who had been transformed by suffering into an instrument of justice as terrible and final as the grave. "I served them exactly what they deserved," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the fading sounds from the dining room. "No more, no less." By midnight, the Whitaker mansion was silent, save for the whispered prayers of the surviving slaves and the scratching of Dr. Hawthorne's pen as he tried to complete the death certificates required by law. His own survival remained a mystery that would puzzle him for the rest of his life. Perhaps his smaller portion, a result of his naturally modest appetite, had saved him. Or perhaps his years of exposure to medicinal substances had given him some resistance to the deadly cocktail Rose had prepared. The official cause of death, recorded in the parish records that exist to this day in the Carolina State Archives, was listed as a sudden fever of unknown origin. Dr. Hawthorne knew this was not accurate, but he also understood that the truth would serve no one. A mass poisoning at one of Charleston's most prominent social gatherings would create a panic throughout the city and destroy the reputation of everyone associated with the Whitaker name. More practically, he recognized that Rose had crafted her revenge with a skill that made proving murder almost impossible. The substances she had used were all naturally occurring, and their combined effect would be impossible to identify with the medical knowledge and investigative techniques available in 1855. Any autopsy would have simply revealed that the victims had died of multiple organ failure, which could be attributed to any number of natural causes. The aftermath of what became known in whispered conversations as the Whitaker tragedy echoed through Charleston society for years. The plantation, with its entire family of owners deceased, was seized by creditors and sold at auction. The mansion itself stood empty for nearly a decade before it was purchased by a northern merchant who was unaware of its history. The slaves of the Whitaker household were scattered to different buyers throughout Carolina. Their own families were broken apart in the cold arithmetic of asset liquidation. Some, like Esther and Marcus, were purchased by planters who valued their experience and skills. Others, particularly the young like Nina, disappeared into the network of human trafficking that supplied labor to the cotton plantations of the Deep South. Jacob survived long enough to be sold to a rice plantation in Georgia, where he died 3 years later in an accident that may or may not have been an accident. Those who knew him said that he never recovered from the trauma of that October night and that he seemed to welcome death when it finally came. Rose herself disappeared completely from the historical record after that night. Some accounts suggest she was sold to a remote plantation in the Carolina swamp country, where she died in obscurity a few years later. Others claim she escaped in the chaos following the discovery of the bodies and made her way to freedom in a northern state or Mexico. But the most persistent legend, whispered among Charleston's Creole community for generations, holds that Rose was never captured or sold because she simply walked away from the plantation that night and vanished into the shadows of the French Quarter. According to this version of the story, she survived by using her extraordinary cooking skills to feed the poorest members of Charleston society, living under an assumed name and finding her redemption by serving those who needed help the most. Dr. Hawthorne, who carried the secret of what he had witnessed for the rest of his life, left behind a private journal that was discovered by his descendants more than a century later. In it, he recorded his observations of that terrible night and his growing understanding of how the crime had been committed. His notes reveal a profound admiration for the precision and skill with which Rose had planned and executed her revenge, even as he struggled with the moral implications of what she had done. She was not a natural-born killer, he wrote in an entry dated several months after the tragedy. She was a woman made into something she never wished to be, by circumstances that would have broken most people long before she reached her breaking point. If there is blame to be assigned in this matter, it must be shared by all of us who participated in or tolerated the system that creates such desperation. The Whitaker mansion, when it was finally reoccupied in the late 1862s, became the site of numerous unexplained events that local lore attributed to the supernatural. Dinner guests reported becoming suddenly ill during meals. Servants complained of strange smells coming from the kitchen, and more than one cook quit after claiming to have seen the ghost of a young black woman standing by the hearth in the pre-dawn hours. These stories, combined with persistent rumors about the true cause of the Whitaker family's demise, contributed to the mansion's reputation as one of Charleston's most haunted houses. The building changed hands frequently over the next few decades, with few owners staying for more than a year or two before selling and moving on. During the Civil War, the mansion was briefly occupied by Union forces and later served as a temporary hospital for wounded soldiers. Military records from the period include several reports of patients experiencing strange, medically unexplained illnesses, leading to speculation that whatever had caused the original tragedy continued to affect anyone who entered the house. In the 1892, the mansion was purchased by a historical society that intended to preserve it as an example of antebellum architecture. However, their efforts were plagued by a series of accidents and setbacks that eventually forced them to abandon the project. The building was finally demolished in 1902, with a local newspaper reporting that the demolition crew found the kitchen in a remarkably good condition despite decades of neglect, as if it had been preserved by some unknown force. The lot where the mansion once stood remained empty for many years before it was developed into a small public garden that exists to this day. Local residents still report strange occurrences in the area. Sudden bouts of illness during community gatherings, the smell of cooking when there is no kitchen nearby, and the occasional sighting of a young black woman in antebellum dress walking through the garden in the early morning hours. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Rose's story lies not in ghost stories or supernatural speculation, but in what it illustrates about the human capacity for both cruelty and resistance. The system of slavery that created the conditions for this tragedy was built on the assumption that human beings could be reduced to property, that their suffering could be ignored, and that their humanity could be denied indefinitely without consequence. Rose's story serves as a stark reminder that this assumption was not only morally wrong, but dangerously naive. Every system of oppression carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, and those seeds are most often sown by the very cruelty the system depends on to sustain itself. The 15 members of the Whitaker family who died that October night were not evil people in a simplistic sense. They were products of their time and place, taught to see slavery as natural and normal, and to view the people they enslaved as fundamentally different from themselves. But their willingness to participate in and benefit from a system built on human suffering created the conditions that ultimately destroyed them. In the end, Rose's revenge was both perfectly understandable and deeply tragic. Understandable because of the inhuman treatment that drove her to it, and tragic because it represented the corruption of a soul that had once found joy in creating nourishment and bringing pleasure to others. The woman who had once taken pride in nurturing became someone who found her purpose in destroying, not because she was inherently evil, but because the world she lived in left her no other path to dignity and justice. This mystery shows that the most terrifying horrors often spring from human choices and social systems rather than supernatural forces. The real ghost that haunts the Whitaker mansion is not the spirit of any individual, but the collective guilt of a society that built its prosperity on a foundation of human bondage. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could a carefully planned revenge really be executed with the precision Rose demonstrated? Or are there elements that seem too perfect to be entirely true? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on whether justice was served or if Rose's actions went too far. If you enjoyed the story and want more chilling tales like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with anyone who loves a good mystery. The darkest chapters of American history often contain the most compelling human dramas, and we'll continue to explore them together. See you in the next video.